behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where photographers wait with hungry lenses and the world watches every royal smile, a 10-year-old princess carries burdens no child should bear. In a world where every tear is scrutinized and every stumble becomes headline news, Princess Charlotte faces pressures that would break most adults. But, on this particular autumn morning, as leaves danced in the crisp London air, something would happen that would change everything, a moment of raw human emotion that would pierce through years of royal protocol and reveal the frightened little girl hidden beneath the crown. What the cameras didn't capture, what the newspapers never reported, was the story of a dedicated royal guard who saw past the title and the expectation to the child who desperately needed someone to simply care. This is that untold story, a tale of unexpected kindness, breaking protocol, and the moment when being human mattered more than being royal. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Princess Charlotte walked with measured steps. Her small hands gripped the straps of her school bag so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, but her face remained composed in the way she had been taught since she could barely walk. At 10 years old, she had already mastered the art of hiding her true feelings behind a mask of royal propriety. Detective Sergeant James Mitchell had been part of the Royal Protection Team for 8 years, but he had never seen the young princess look quite so fragile. There was something in her posture, the way she held her shoulders just a little too rigid, that made him pay closer attention as he maintained his position near the palace entrance. He had watched her grow from a toddling child who would wave enthusiastically at anyone who smiled at her, to this composed young lady who seemed to carry the weight of expectation on her small shoulders. The palace corridors were buzzing with their usual morning activity. Staff members moved efficiently through their routines, preparing for another day of royal engagements, public appearances, and the endless schedule that governed every moment of the royal family's lives. Princess Charlotte's day was mapped out to the minute: breakfast at 7:30, departure for school at 8:15, followed by afternoon engagements that would keep her busy until evening. There was no room in the schedule for a 10-year-old's natural need for spontaneity or simple childhood pleasures. As Charlotte approached the main entrance where her car waited, Detective Mitchell noticed her steps becoming slower, more hesitant. She paused at the ornate mirror in the entrance hall, adjusting her school uniform with practiced precision. Her reflection showed a perfectly composed young princess, but Mitchell had been trained to observe details that others might miss. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way she blinked a few extra times as if fighting back something she couldn't allow herself to show. The princess's morning had actually started much earlier than anyone realized. She had been awake since 5 o'clock, lying in her bed and staring at the ceiling while her mind raced with worries that no child should have to bear. Tomorrow was the anniversary of her great-grandmother's passing, and she was expected to attend a solemn memorial service where cameras would be watching her every expression, analyzing every gesture for signs of appropriate grief or inappropriate emotion. But it wasn't just the memorial service that was weighing on her mind. The previous week, she had overheard a conversation between her parents about the increasing media scrutiny surrounding the family. Photographers had been following her to school, trying to capture candid moments that could be turned into sensational stories. She had heard her mother on the phone with palace staff, discussing new security measures and stricter protocols that would further limit Charlotte's already restricted freedom. School had become another source of stress rather than the refuge it should have been for a child her age. Her classmates, once natural friends who saw her simply as Charlotte, had become increasingly aware of her royal status. Some tried too hard to befriend her, while others seemed intimidated by her position. The natural, easy friendships she had enjoyed as a younger child were becoming complicated by the reality of who she was expected to become. Detective Mitchell watched as Charlotte's personal aide approached her with a tablet, going through the day's schedule one final time. He could see the young princess nodding politely, but there was something mechanical about her responses, as if she was operating on automatic pilot. The aide mentioned that there would be photographers waiting outside the school, as there had been every day for the past month, and reminded Charlotte to maintain proper posture and a pleasant expression during the brief walk from car to school entrance. The weight of constant performance was something that Detective Mitchell had observed affecting many members of the royal family, but seeing it in someone so young troubled him deeply. He remembered his own children at 10 years old, worried about homework and playground friendships, not about how their facial expressions might be interpreted by millions of strangers or whether their posture met the standards expected of future leaders. As they prepared to leave for school, Charlotte's younger brother Prince George appeared in the entrance hall, his natural exuberance a stark contrast to his sister's controlled demeanor. He was chattering excitedly about a science project, his backpack bouncing as he walked, completely oblivious to the tension that seemed to surround Charlotte like an invisible cloud. Detective Mitchell noticed how Charlotte's expression softened when she looked at her brother, a genuine smile replacing the practiced one she had been wearing moments before. But the moment was brief. As soon as the palace doors opened and they stepped into the public eye, both children transformed into their public personas. George's chatter quieted to appropriate levels, and Charlotte's smile became fixed and formal once again. The waiting photographers immediately began snapping pictures, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects as they captured every moment of the short journey to the waiting cars. Detective Mitchell followed at a discreet distance, his trained eyes scanning the crowd of photographers and onlookers while simultaneously keeping watch over his young charges. He noticed how Charlotte's steps became even more measured under the scrutiny of the cameras, how she seemed to be holding her breath as she navigated the gauntlet of public attention that had become a daily routine. The ride to school was conducted in relative silence. Charlotte stared out the window at the London streets, watching ordinary families going about their morning routines without the burden of constant observation. She saw children her age walking to school with friends, laughing and talking freely, their biggest worry whether they had remembered their homework or packed their lunch. The contrast between their carefree existence and her own carefully orchestrated life was not lost on her, despite her young age. Detective Mitchell, seated in the front passenger seat, occasionally glanced back at the princess through the rearview mirror. He could see her reflection in the window she was staring through, and what he saw concerned him. There was a sadness in her eyes that seemed far too mature for someone her age, a weight of understanding that spoke to burdens no child should have to carry. As they approached the school, Charlotte straightened her shoulders and adjusted her expression once again. The school gates were lined with photographers, just as they had been every day for weeks. Some called out her name, hoping to get her to look directly at their cameras, while others simply aimed their lenses and fired away continuously. The young princess had learned to look straight ahead, to maintain her composure, and to never react to the calls and comments from the crowd. But today something was different. As Charlotte stepped out of the car and began her walk toward the school entrance, Detective Mitchell noticed a group of photographers who seemed more aggressive than usual. They were pushing closer to the barriers, their calls louder and more insistent. One photographer, clearly trying to provoke a reaction, called out a question about her great-grandmother's memorial service, asking how she felt about attending such a sad event. The question hit Charlotte like a physical blow. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, and Detective Mitchell saw her stumble slightly. She quickly recovered, continuing her walk toward the school entrance, but something had shifted. The mask of royal propriety that she wore so expertly was beginning to crack, and Mitchell could see the frightened, overwhelmed child beneath the surface starting to emerge. As Charlotte disappeared through the school doors, Detective Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning immediately to the palace as protocol dictated, he remained at the school, positioning himself where he could observe the ongoing photographer presence. His instincts, honed by years of protection work, were telling him that something was building toward a breaking point, and he wanted to be prepared for whatever might happen when the school day ended. The hours passed slowly as Detective Mitchell maintained his vigilant watch. He observed the photographers' behavior, noting which ones seemed most aggressive and which might pose potential problems later. He also found himself thinking about Princess Charlotte, wondering how she was coping with the pressure that seemed to be mounting daily. The memorial service tomorrow would bring even more intense media attention, and he worried about how a 10-year-old child could possibly handle the additional stress. When the school day finally ended and Charlotte emerged from the building, Detective Mitchell immediately noticed that something was wrong. Her usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by something much more fragile. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she might have been crying, and her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her school bag. The morning's carefully arranged composure had completely disappeared, leaving behind a child who looked overwhelmed and frightened. The photographers immediately sensed vulnerability and pressed closer to the barriers, their cameras firing continuously as they tried to capture images of the princess in distress. Their calls became more insistent, more invasive, as they shouted questions about her emotional state and demanded she look at their cameras. The feeding frenzy of media attention was exactly what Detective Mitchell had feared, and he quickly moved to position himself between Charlotte and the most aggressive photographers. But it was too late. The cumulative pressure of months of constant scrutiny, combined with the stress of tomorrow's memorial service and the overwhelming nature of her public role, finally proved too much for the young princess to bear. As she walked toward her waiting car, surrounded by the chaos of clicking cameras and shouting voices, Princess Charlotte's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. The tears came suddenly, and, without warning, streaming down Princess Charlotte's face as she stood frozen outside her school. The wall of cameras and shouting voices that surrounded her seemed to close in, creating a suffocating barrier between her and the safety of her waiting car. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the 10-year-old princess was completely overwhelmed, unable to move forward or retreat, trapped in a nightmare of public scrutiny that she had no power to escape. Detective Sergeant James Mitchell didn't hesitate. Years of training and protocol flew out the window as he witnessed a child in genuine distress. Without waiting for authorization or considering the potential consequences for his career, he stepped forward and positioned himself directly between Charlotte and the crowd of photographers. His imposing figure created an immediate shield, blocking their view of the princess and giving her a moment of privacy in which to collect herself. The photographers immediately protested, shouting that they had a right to take pictures and demanding that Mitchell move aside. Some continued to push forward, trying to get around him to capture images of the crying princess, while others began photographing Mitchell himself, documenting his unprecedented intervention. In 8 years of royal protection duty, he had never broken protocol so dramatically, but seeing Charlotte's distress had triggered something deeper than professional obligation. Charlotte stood behind Mitchell's protective presence, her small body shaking with sobs that she had been holding back for weeks. The relief of finally being shielded from the constant observation was overwhelming, but it also opened the floodgates to all the emotions she had been forced to suppress. Fear, sadness, frustration, and exhaustion poured out in waves as she struggled to catch her breath between sobs. Mitchell spoke quietly over his shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Princess Charlotte, I need you to take slow, deep breaths with me. Can you do that?" His tone was nothing like the formal address she was accustomed to from palace staff. Instead, it was the voice of someone who saw her as a child first and a princess second, someone who understood that in this moment, royal protocol mattered far less than basic human compassion. The princess tried to follow his instruction, but the sobs continued to overwhelm her. The weight of months of pressure, the anticipation of tomorrow's memorial service, and the constant feeling of being watched and judged had finally broken through her carefully constructed defenses. She felt like she was drowning in expectations and responsibilities that were far too heavy for her small shoulders to bear. Behind them, the crowd of photographers and onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding before them. Some members of the public began to express their displeasure with the photographers' behavior, calling out for them to leave the child alone and show some basic decency. A few parents who were collecting their own children from the school spoke up angrily about the harassment of a 10-year-old girl, their voices adding to the chaos of the scene. Mitchell could hear palace security calling his name through his earpiece, demanding to know what was happening and ordering him to step aside and allow the photographers access. But he ignored the commands, focusing entirely on the frightened child behind him. His own daughter was Charlotte's age, and he couldn't imagine standing by and watching her suffer in such a public and humiliating way. Charlotte's personal aide appeared at Mitchell's side, looking flustered and uncertain about how to handle the situation. The aide had been trained to manage royal protocols and schedules, but nothing had prepared her for dealing with a princess having an emotional breakdown in front of dozens of cameras. She tried to guide Charlotte toward the car, but the princess seemed unable to move, paralyzed by the intensity of her emotional release and the overwhelming nature of the situation. The school's headmaster emerged from the building, drawn by the commotion outside his institution. He was visibly distressed by the scene unfolding on his grounds, particularly the aggressive behavior of the photographers toward one of his students. He approached the group surrounding Charlotte, offering to provide a private space inside the school where she could recover away from the public eye. Mitchell seized on this suggestion immediately. "Princess Charlotte," he said gently, turning slightly so she could hear him clearly while still maintaining his protective position, "would you like to go inside with me for a few minutes?" Just until you feel ready? His tone was patient and understanding, giving her permission to take the time she needed without feeling ashamed of her emotional response. Charlotte nodded through her tears, grateful for the offer of escape from the chaos surrounding her. Mitchell carefully guided her toward the school entrance, maintaining his position as a barrier between her and the cameras. The photographers continued to call out and take pictures, but their access was significantly limited by Mitchell's intervention and the headmaster's authority on school grounds. Inside the school's main office, Charlotte finally found a moment of peace. The walls blocked out the sound of the photographers, and the familiar environment of her school provided a sense of safety that had been missing from her public life for so long. Mitchell remained nearby, but gave her space to process her emotions without the pressure of constant observation. The headmaster's secretary provided Charlotte with tissues and a glass of water, treating her with the same gentle care they would show any distressed student. For the first time in months, Charlotte felt like she was being seen as a child who needed comfort rather than a princess who needed to maintain appearances. The relief was almost as overwhelming as the emotions that had triggered her breakdown. Mitchell used this quiet moment to contact palace security, explaining the situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The response was immediate and tense. He had broken protocol by intervening so directly, and there would be serious consequences for his actions. However, the immediate priority was getting Charlotte safely back to the palace without further incident. Charlotte's parents were notified of the situation, and, within minutes, additional security personnel arrived at the school. The palace communications team was already working on damage control, preparing statements about the princess's well-being and the inappropriateness of aggressive media behavior toward children. But, for Charlotte, sitting in the quiet school office with Detective Mitchell nearby, the political implications of her breakdown were far from her mind. As her tears began to subside, Charlotte found herself looking at Mitchell with something approaching gratitude. In a world where every adult in her life was primarily concerned with how her behavior reflected on the royal family, he had acted purely out of concern for her welfare as a child. It was a kindness she had rarely experienced, and it made her realize how isolated she had become in her royal role. Mitchell noticed her gaze and offered her a gentle smile. "Feeling a bit better, princess?" he asked, his tone warm and encouraging. Charlotte nodded, though her eyes were still red and her face was blotchy from crying. She looked much younger than her 10 years, stripped of the composed maturity that royal life had forced upon her. The school office became a temporary sanctuary where Charlotte could simply be a child who had experienced an overwhelming day. The headmaster, a kind man who had always been protective of his royal student, sat quietly nearby, ready to offer additional support if needed. His presence reminded Charlotte that there were adults in her life who saw her value beyond her royal status. Outside, the crowd of photographers continued their vigil, but their numbers were gradually being reduced by local police who had been called to manage the situation. The school's security staff worked with palace personnel to create a clear path from the building to Charlotte's waiting car, though everyone knew that the journey would still be challenging. Mitchell's earpiece crackled with updates from palace security, informing him of the arrival of Charlotte's parents and additional protection officers. The princess would be escorted home by a larger security detail, and Mitchell would be required to report immediately to his supervisors for a formal review of his actions. The career implications of his intervention were becoming clear, but he felt no regret for choosing Charlotte's welfare over protocol. Charlotte overheard some of these conversations, and a new worry began to creep into her already troubled mind. She realized that Mitchell might face consequences for helping her, and the thought that her emotional breakdown could hurt someone who had shown her such kindness added another layer to her distress. In her young mind, it seemed that everything she did or felt had negative consequences for the people around her. As they prepared to leave the school, Mitchell knelt down to Charlotte's level, speaking to her with the same gentle authority he had maintained throughout the crisis. "Princess Charlotte," he said quietly, "I want you to remember that what happened today wasn't your fault. You're allowed to have feelings, and you're allowed to express them. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were a revelation to Charlotte, who had been raised to believe that her emotions were secondary to her public role. The idea that she had a right to feel overwhelmed, scared, or sad was foreign to her experience of royal life. Mitchell's validation of her emotional response was perhaps the first time an adult had given her permission to be genuinely human rather than perpetually royal. The journey back to the palace was conducted with significantly more security than the morning trip to school. Additional cars flanked Charlotte's vehicle, and the route had been adjusted to avoid areas where photographers might be waiting. Inside her car, Charlotte sat quietly, processing the events of the day and Mitchell's words of encouragement. The palace corridors seemed different when Charlotte returned home. The same staff members moved through the same routines, but she now saw them through the lens of her experience at the school. She wondered how many of them had ever broken protocol to help someone in need, or whether they were also bound by rules and expectations that human compassion had become secondary to royal procedure. Charlotte's parents were waiting for her in the family's private quarters, their faces showing a mixture of concern for their daughter and worry about the public relations implications of the day's events. The princess could see the weight of their own responsibilities reflected in their expressions, and she began to understand that the pressure she felt was part of a larger burden that affected their entire family. The evening brought meetings with palace officials, discussions about increased security measures, and reviews of Charlotte's public schedule in light of the day's events. Throughout these conversations, Charlotte found herself thinking about Detective Mitchell and wondering what consequences he would face for choosing to help her. The knowledge that her moment of vulnerability might cost him his job added guilt to her already complex emotional state. As night fell and Charlotte finally found herself alone in her room, she reflected on the day that had changed everything. For the first time in her young life, she had experienced what it felt like to have her emotions acknowledged and protected rather than managed and controlled. Mitchell's intervention had given her a glimpse of what it might feel like to be seen as a child first and a princess second, and that realization would stay with her long after the immediate crisis had passed. The following morning arrived with an unusual quiet in the palace corridors. Detective Sergeant James Mitchell had been suspended pending a full investigation into his breach of protocol, and his absence was felt throughout the security detail. Princess Charlotte woke early, the events of the previous day replaying in her mind as she stared at the ceiling of her bedroom. Today was the memorial service for her great-grandmother, and the weight of expectation felt heavier than ever. Charlotte's mother, the Princess of Wales, appeared in her doorway shortly after dawn. Her face showed the strain of the previous day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. She sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed, something she rarely had time to do during their structured daily routines. For a moment, mother and daughter simply looked at each other, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully ordered world. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Charlotte's mother spoke honestly about the pressures of royal life, acknowledging for the first time that the expectations placed on Charlotte were perhaps too heavy for someone so young. She admitted that she and Charlotte's father had been so focused on preparing their daughter for her future role that they had forgotten to protect her present childhood. Charlotte listened to her mother's words with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that her feelings were finally being acknowledged, and sadness that it had taken such a public breakdown for her family to see her struggle. She told her mother about the months of building pressure, the constant feeling of being watched and judged, and the fear that she would never be able to live up to the expectations placed upon her. The memorial service loomed large in both of their minds. Hundreds of guests would be in attendance, along with television cameras that would broadcast the event to millions of viewers worldwide. Charlotte would be expected to maintain perfect composure throughout the ceremony, despite being asked to honor a great-grandmother she had deeply loved while dealing with her own emotional turmoil from the previous day. Meanwhile, in a small office across London, Detective Mitchell was meeting with his supervisors to discuss his future with the Royal Protection Unit. The room was filled with tension as senior officers reviewed his actions and their implications for royal security protocols. Mitchell sat calmly as accusations flew around him, his conviction that he had done the right thing unwavering despite the professional consequences he was facing. The investigating officers struggled to understand how someone with Mitchell's exemplary record could have so flagrantly disregarded established procedures. They questioned his judgment, his loyalty to the royal family, and his fitness for continued service. But Mitchell's responses remained steady and principled. He had seen a child in distress and had acted to protect her, just as he would have done for any child in similar circumstances. Word of Mitchell's suspension had reached some members of the royal household staff, creating divisions between those who supported his actions and those who believed protocol should never be broken, regardless of the circumstances. The debate reflected larger questions about how the royal family balanced their public duties with their private humanity, particularly when it came to protecting the youngest members from the harsh realities of public scrutiny. Back at the palace, Charlotte was being prepared for the memorial service by a team of stylists and advisors who seemed unusually gentle in their approach. Word had clearly spread about the previous day's events, and there was a new awareness among the staff about the emotional toll their young charge was experiencing. The process of getting ready, usually conducted in efficient silence, was accompanied by kind words and patient understanding. Charlotte's dress for the memorial was a somber navy blue, appropriate for the solemn occasion but also a stark reminder of the adult responsibilities she was expected to shoulder. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not a 10-year-old girl but a royal representative who would be judged on every expression, every gesture, every moment of the ceremony. The reflection staring back at her looked older than her years, bearing the weight of expectations that had aged her beyond her time. The car journey to Westminster Abbey was conducted in careful silence. Charlotte sat between her parents, their presence offering some comfort but also serving as a reminder of the public performance that lay ahead. She found herself thinking about Detective Mitchell and wondering what he was doing at that moment. His absence from the security detail felt like losing the only adult who had truly understood her perspective as a child rather than just a royal. As their convoy approached Westminster Abbey, Charlotte could see the crowds of people lining the streets and the media crews positioned at strategic points to capture every moment of the royal family's arrival. The familiar sight of cameras and crowds, which had once seemed normal to her, now triggered memories of the previous day's overwhelming experience. She felt her breathing become shallow as anxiety began to build in her chest. Her father noticed her distress immediately and reached over to take her hand. His touch was gentle and reassuring, a reminder that beneath their public roles, they were still a family who cared for each other. He spoke quietly to her about focusing on honoring her great-grandmother's memory rather than on the cameras and crowds, giving her a purpose beyond simply performing for the public. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was both grand and solemn. Hundreds of guests filled the ancient pews, their faces reflecting the gravity of the occasion and the respect they held for the woman they had gathered to remember. Charlotte took her place with her family in the front row, acutely aware that every eye in the building was upon them and that cameras were documenting every moment of the service. The ceremony began with traditional hymns that echoed through the abbey's soaring arches. Charlotte tried to focus on the music and the words being spoken about her great-grandmother, but she found herself struggling with the weight of public attention. Every time she shifted in her seat or adjusted her posture, she was conscious of how her movements might be interpreted by the watching world. As the service progressed, Charlotte's mind wandered to memories of her great-grandmother, a woman who had somehow managed to balance the demands of royal duty with genuine warmth and humanity. She remembered private moments when her great-grandmother had spoken to her about the importance of serving others while still maintaining her own sense of self. Those conversations felt particularly relevant now, as Charlotte struggled to find her own identity within the constraints of royal life. The eulogy delivered by the Archbishop was moving and personal, painting a picture of a woman who had dedicated her life to service while never losing sight of her role as a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Charlotte found herself crying quietly as she listened to stories about the woman she had known personally, tears that were genuine grief rather than the manufactured emotion often expected at public events. For once, her tears felt appropriate and accepted. The solemnity of the occasion provided a context where genuine emotion was not only permitted but expected. Charlotte realized that this was perhaps the first time in months that she could express her true feelings without fear of judgment or criticism. The relief of being able to grieve openly was overwhelming in its own way. As the service concluded and the royal family prepared to leave the abbey, Charlotte felt a strange mixture of sadness and strength. The memory of her great-grandmother's example had reminded her that it was possible to fulfill royal duties while still maintaining one's humanity and authenticity. She began to understand that the problem wasn't with her emotions but with a system that demanded their suppression in favor of artificial perfection. The journey back to the palace was quieter than the morning trip, with each family member lost in their own thoughts about the service and its significance. Charlotte found herself thinking not just about her great-grandmother but about the adults in her life who had shown her genuine care and concern. Detective Mitchell's absence from the security detail felt particularly acute, as his intervention the previous day had demonstrated the kind of protective compassion her great-grandmother would have approved of. That evening, as Charlotte was finally able to retreat to her private quarters, she received unexpected news. Her parents had made a decision about Detective Mitchell's suspension and the broader questions it had raised about the balance between protocol and humanity in their family's life. The conversation that followed would mark another turning point in Charlotte's understanding of her role and the people who genuinely cared about her welfare. Charlotte's father sat with her in her sitting room, speaking to her with an honesty that reflected the new awareness her breakdown had brought to their family dynamics. He explained that Detective Mitchell's actions had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the pressure they had been placing on their children and the need to prioritize their well-being over public perception. The decision they had reached about Mitchell's future reflected this new understanding and would signal a shift in how the royal family approached the balance between duty and humanity. Charlotte listened to her father's words with growing hope, beginning to believe that her moment of vulnerability might actually lead to positive changes rather than just consequences and restrictions. As night fell over the palace, Charlotte found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: hope for the future. The events of the past 2 days had been traumatic and overwhelming, but they had also opened doors to conversations and connections that had been missing from her life. The memorial service had reminded her of her great-grandmother's example of combining duty with authenticity, while Detective Mitchell's intervention had shown her that there were adults who valued her well-being over royal protocol. The changes that would follow in the days ahead would transform Charlotte's daily life in ways both small and significant. But, more importantly, they would begin to restore her sense of herself as a child who happened to be a princess, rather than a princess who had forgotten how to be a child. The journey back to that balance would not be easy, but, for the first time in months, it felt possible. Charlotte fell asleep that night with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in far too long. The memory of Detective Mitchell's protective presence and her great-grandmother's example of graceful authenticity combined to give her hope that she could find her own way to navigate the complexities of royal life while still maintaining her humanity and emotional well-being. 3 weeks after the memorial service, Princess Charlotte's life had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. The palace corridors carried a different energy, as staff members had been quietly briefed on new protocols that prioritized the young princess's emotional well-being alongside her royal duties. The change was most noticeable in the reduced frequency of public appearances and the increased private time built into her schedule, allowing her to simply be a child for portions of each day. Detective Sergeant James Mitchell had been reinstated to his position after an extensive review that ultimately concluded his actions had been justified given the circumstances. However, his role had evolved beyond traditional security work to include something unprecedented in royal protection. He was now specifically tasked with monitoring the emotional welfare of the young royals and intervening when protocol needed to yield to basic human compassion. The decision to reinstate Mitchell had not been reached easily. Palace officials had spent hours debating the implications of officially sanctioning the kind of intervention he had made. Some argued that it would set a dangerous precedent, potentially undermining the structure and discipline that royal protocol required. Others maintained that the well-being of the royal children should take precedence over rigid adherence to tradition, particularly when those children were showing clear signs of emotional distress. Charlotte herself had played a crucial role in the discussions about Mitchell's future. In an unprecedented move, she had been invited to share her perspective on the events of that difficult day outside her school. Her articulate explanation of how Mitchell's intervention had made her feel protected rather than exposed had impressed the palace officials and influenced their final decision. It was perhaps the first time her opinion as a child had been genuinely considered in matters affecting her life. The conversation between Charlotte and the senior palace staff had been a revelation for everyone involved. The 10-year-old princess had demonstrated a maturity and insight that surprised the adults, but she had also revealed the depth of pressure and anxiety she had been experiencing for months. Her honest description of feeling like she was constantly performing rather than living had forced palace officials to confront uncomfortable truths about the impact of royal life on the youngest family members. Charlotte's relationship with Detective Mitchell had deepened since his return to duty. While he maintained appropriate professional boundaries, their interaction had taken on a quality of mutual respect and understanding that was unusual in the traditionally hierarchical world of royal service. Mitchell had become someone Charlotte could trust to see her as a person first and a princess second, a perspective that was rare and precious in her carefully controlled environment. The media attention following Charlotte's breakdown had initially been intense and largely negative, focusing on security failures and breaches of protocol. However, public opinion had gradually shifted as more details emerged about the circumstances that had led to the incident. Parents across the country had expressed sympathy for a child who was clearly struggling under pressures that no 10-year-old should face, and criticism had begun to focus more on the media's aggressive tactics than on the princess's emotional response. This shift in public perception had given the royal family additional motivation to implement changes in how they managed their children's public exposure. New guidelines were established regarding photography of the young royals at school and during private family time. While the media's right to document public royal events was maintained, there was now greater recognition of the children's need for privacy during their everyday activities. Charlotte's school had also implemented new measures to protect their royal student from excessive media attention. The aggressive behavior of photographers during the incident had prompted discussions between school administrators and palace officials about creating a more supportive environment for Charlotte's education. These measures included better coordination with local police to manage media presence and clearer boundaries about appropriate behavior on school grounds. The changes extended beyond external protections to Charlotte's daily routine within the palace itself. Her schedule was restructured to include regular periods of unstructured time, allowing her to pursue activities she enjoyed without the pressure of preparation for public appearances. These changes seemed small but represented a fundamental shift in priorities from constant preparation for royal duties to balanced child development. Charlotte's parents had also made significant adjustments to their own approach to their daughter's upbringing. They began spending more unscheduled time with their children, engaging in activities that had nothing to do with royal training or public preparation. These moments of normal family life became precious opportunities for Charlotte to express her thoughts and feelings without the filter of royal propriety. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of regular sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in helping young people cope with public pressure and performance anxiety. These sessions were conducted in complete privacy and confidentiality, giving Charlotte a safe space to process her emotions and develop healthy coping strategies. The decision to provide this support represented a new openness about mental health within the royal family. Detective Mitchell's expanded role had evolved to include subtle monitoring of Charlotte's emotional state during public appearances. He had learned to recognize the early signs of her anxiety and stress, allowing him to anticipate situations where intervention might be necessary. This proactive approach had already prevented several potential incidents by addressing problems before they escalated to crisis levels. The relationship between Charlotte and Mitchell had become a source of stability and security in her increasingly complex world. While their interactions remained professional, there was an underlying foundation of trust and understanding that allowed Charlotte to feel genuinely protected. Mitchell's presence at public events had become a source of comfort, reminding her that someone was watching out for her welfare rather than just her performance. Charlotte's improved emotional state had begun to show in her public appearances. While she remained appropriately composed and professional, there was a new authenticity to her interactions with the public that reflected her growing confidence and sense of security. The rigid perfection that had characterized her earlier appearances had been replaced by a more natural and engaging presence that actually enhanced her effectiveness as a royal representative. The other children in Charlotte's family had also benefited from the changes implemented after her crisis. Her younger brother and sister found themselves with more freedom to be children, with greater protection from media scrutiny and more opportunities for normal childhood experiences. The entire family had gained a new understanding of the importance of balancing royal duties with personal well-being. Staff members throughout the palace had witnessed these changes with a mixture of relief and admiration. Many had been concerned about Charlotte's well-being but had felt constrained by protocol from expressing their worries or suggesting alternatives. The official acknowledgement that child welfare should take precedence over tradition had empowered staff members to speak up when they observed concerning situations. The impact of these changes extended beyond the immediate royal family to influence broader discussions about the treatment of children in the public eye. Charlotte's experience had sparked conversations about the responsibilities of media, institutions, and society in protecting young people who find themselves in positions of public attention. These discussions had led to new guidelines and increased awareness about the psychological impact of constant scrutiny on developing minds. Charlotte herself had begun to develop a more nuanced understanding of her role and her relationship with the public. With the support of her family, her therapy sessions, and the protective presence of people like Detective Mitchell, she was learning to navigate the complexities of royal life while maintaining her authentic self. The process was not always easy, but she now had tools and support systems that had been missing during her earlier struggles. The transformation in Charlotte's daily experience was perhaps most evident in her return to school. The enhanced security measures and media management protocols had created an environment where she could focus on her education and friendships rather than constantly worrying about public scrutiny. Her relationships with classmates had improved as the external pressures diminished, allowing for more natural social interactions. Looking back on the events that had triggered these changes, Charlotte had gained perspective on her emotional breakdown that helped her understand it as a necessary catalyst rather than a failure. She had learned that expressing genuine emotions was not a weakness but a fundamental part of being human, something that even princesses were allowed to experience. This understanding had become a foundation for her developing sense of self within her royal role. As the weeks passed, the new systems and approaches that had been implemented began to feel natural rather than revolutionary. Charlotte's improved well-being had a positive impact on her entire family, demonstrating that prioritizing the children's emotional health actually enhanced rather than diminished their ability to fulfill their royal responsibilities. The lessons learned from her crisis had created a more sustainable and humane approach to raising royal children in the modern world. 6 months after the incident that had changed everything, Princess Charlotte stood in the garden of Kensington Palace, watching her younger siblings play freely on the perfectly manicured lawn. The spring sunshine filtered through the ancient oak trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the grounds where generations of royal children had grown up. But this scene was different from those of previous generations, marked by a new understanding of what it meant to balance royal duty with childhood innocence. Detective Sergeant James Mitchell observed from a discreet distance, his role now encompassing not just physical security but emotional well-being. The change in Charlotte over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The rigid tension that had once defined her posture had been replaced by a more natural grace, and her interactions with others reflected a confidence that came from knowing she was valued as a person rather than just a royal symbol. The transformation had not been instant or easy. There had been difficult moments, setbacks, and times when the old patterns of anxiety and pressure had threatened to reassert themselves. But the support systems that had been put in place after Charlotte's crisis had held firm, providing her with the tools and protection she needed to navigate her unique challenges while still fulfilling her royal responsibilities. Charlotte's therapy sessions had become a cornerstone of her emotional development. Dr. Sarah Harrison, the child psychologist who worked with her weekly, had helped Charlotte develop strategies for managing public pressure and maintaining her sense of self in difficult situations. These sessions had taught her that having feelings about her circumstances was not only normal but healthy, and that learning to process those emotions constructively was a valuable life skill. The changes in Charlotte's life had rippled outward to affect the entire royal household. Staff members had undergone training on recognizing signs of stress in children and responding appropriately to emotional needs. The traditional hierarchy that had sometimes prevented staff from expressing concern about the young royals' well-being had been restructured to encourage communication and advocacy for the children's welfare. Palace protocols had been revised to include regular reviews of the children's schedules and emotional state, ensuring that their commitments remained age-appropriate and sustainable. These reviews involved input from parents, educators, security personnel like Detective Mitchell, and the children themselves, creating a comprehensive support network focused on their holistic development rather than just their royal training. The media's relationship with the young royals had also evolved significantly. While public interest in the royal family remained high, there was now greater awareness of the impact that aggressive coverage could have on children. New guidelines had been established that balanced the public's right to information with the children's need for privacy and normal development. These changes had been supported by public opinion, which had shifted strongly in favor of protecting royal children from excessive scrutiny. Charlotte's relationship with Detective Mitchell had become one of the most positive aspects of her daily life. While he maintained appropriate professional boundaries, his presence represented security and understanding in a way that went beyond physical protection. Their interactions had taught Charlotte that adults could be trusted to prioritize her well-being over their own career advancement or adherence to rigid protocols. The lessons learned from Charlotte's crisis had influenced decisions about her siblings' upbringing as well. Prince George and Princess Louis were growing up with more balanced schedules and greater protection from public pressure, benefiting from the insights gained through Charlotte's difficult experience. The family had developed new traditions and routines that emphasized private family time and normal childhood experiences alongside their royal duties. Charlotte's academic performance had improved significantly since the implementation of the new support systems. With reduced anxiety and better emotional regulation, she was able to focus more effectively on her studies and participate more fully in school activities. Her teachers had noticed increased confidence in her interactions with classmates and a greater willingness to express her own opinions and ideas. The success of the changes made to support Charlotte had begun to influence broader discussions about child welfare in high-profile families. Other institutions and families dealing with public attention had reached out to learn from the royal family's experience, leading to the development of new best practices for protecting children who find themselves in the public eye through no choice of their own. Charlotte herself had become more articulate about her experiences and needs, developing the confidence to speak up when she felt overwhelmed or when circumstances were becoming too demanding. This self-advocacy was perhaps one of the most important skills she had learned, giving her agency in situations where she had previously felt powerless. Her ability to communicate her emotional state had prevented several potential crises and allowed for proactive adjustments to her schedule and commitments. The memorial service for Charlotte's great-grandmother, which had initially seemed like an insurmountable challenge, had become a turning point in her understanding of her royal role. She had learned that it was possible to honor her responsibilities while still maintaining her authentic emotional responses. The service had taught her that genuine grief was more appropriate and meaningful than manufactured composure, a lesson that applied to many aspects of her public life. Detective Mitchell's expanded role had proven so successful that similar positions were being created for other members of the Royal Protection Team. The concept of holistic security that encompassed emotional and psychological well-being alongside physical safety was becoming a new standard for royal protection services. Mitchell's willingness to prioritize Charlotte's immediate needs over protocol had demonstrated that sometimes breaking rules was the most responsible course of action. Charlotte's improved emotional health had actually enhanced her effectiveness in royal duties rather than diminishing it. Her more natural and authentic presence at public events had been well received by the public, who appreciated seeing genuine personality rather than rigid perfection. This positive reception had reinforced the wisdom of the changes made to support her well-being and had encouraged further adjustments to make royal life more sustainable for young family members. The garden where Charlotte now played with her siblings had become a symbol of the transformation in their family's approach to royal life. It was a space where they could be children first and royals second, where their laughter and energy were valued over their composure and protocol. The security measures that protected this private time were invisible but comprehensive, allowing the children to experience normal childhood moments while remaining safe from intrusion. As Detective Mitchell watched Charlotte help her younger brother with a difficult climbing frame, he reflected on how different this scene was from the crisis outside her school 6 months earlier. The frightened, overwhelmed child who had broken down in tears had grown into a more confident and resilient young person who understood that she had both support and agency in navigating her unique life circumstances. Charlotte's story had become an inspiration within the palace and beyond, demonstrating that even the most traditional institutions could evolve when the well-being of children was at stake. Her crisis had forced everyone around her to confront uncomfortable truths about the pressures placed on young royals and had led to meaningful changes that would benefit not just her but future generations of royal children. The relationship between Charlotte and her parents had also been transformed by the events of that difficult day. They had learned to see their daughter's emotional needs as equally important to her royal training, and their family dynamics had become more open and supportive. Regular family meetings now included discussions about each child's feelings and concerns, creating a culture of emotional honesty that strengthened their bonds. Looking toward the future, Charlotte faced her royal responsibilities with a new sense of balance and perspective. She understood that her role came with unique challenges and pressures, but she also knew that she had the support and tools necessary to meet those challenges while maintaining her mental and emotional health. The changes implemented after her crisis had created a framework for sustainable royal service that prioritized human well-being alongside duty. As the afternoon sun began to set over the palace gardens, Charlotte called to Detective Mitchell, asking if he would join her siblings in their game. The request was simple but significant, representing the trust and comfort that had developed between them. Mitchell's decision to step forward and intervene during her moment of crisis had not only changed the trajectory of that particular day but had fundamentally altered the approach to protecting and supporting the young royals. The story that had begun with tears and breakdown had evolved into one of resilience and positive change. Charlotte's experience had demonstrated that even in the most traditional and protocol-driven environments, human compassion could prevail when a child's well-being was at stake. Her journey from crisis to confidence had created a new model for balancing royal duty with childhood development, ensuring that future young royals would have the support and protection they needed to thrive in their unique roles. As darkness fell over the palace, Charlotte went to bed that night feeling secure in the knowledge that she was surrounded by adults who valued her happiness and well-being above all else. The memory of Detective Mitchell's protective intervention had become a reminder that there were people in her life who would always put her needs first, even when it meant challenging established systems and protocols. This understanding had given her the confidence to embrace her royal future while maintaining her authentic self, creating a foundation for a lifetime of meaningful service balanced with personal fulfillment.